The first Friday after my husband came home from the hospital, I didn't send the money. I sat with my phone in my hand and I looked at the transfer screen and I thought about all the other Fridays and then I closed the app. My mother called at 6:30, which was unusual because she never called me. I always called her, and she said I think there was a problem with the bank. The money didn't come through, and I said I know, it's not coming through anymore, and there was this long silence and then she said, well, we have expenses, your father's medications. And I said Dad's medications are covered by Medicare and you told me 2 years ago he needed a new prescription that cost $400 a month and I've been paying that and I checked and the medication doesn't exist. There's no record of it anywhere, and she said well he has other expenses, and I said no Mom, he doesn't and I hung up. She called back 17 times that night. I didn't answer. My brother called the next morning, his voice smooth and warm like honey poured over glass, and he said I heard you're upset about some money thing, and I said I'm not upset, I'm just not sending money anymore, and he laughed. This light musical laugh that I'd heard him use at parties and dinners and family gatherings, and he said well it's not really about the money, is it? It's about Mom and Dad paying attention to me instead of you. And I said it's about $80,000 you stole. And his voice changed then, the warmth draining out of it like water from a sink, and he said I didn't steal anything, they gave it to me freely, and I said it wasn't theirs to give, and he said you gave it to them, it became theirs, that's how gifts work, and I said it was for groceries and medications, and he said well you should have specified in writing then, shouldn't you have, and I hung up on him too. That night, I went to see my grandfather. He lives in a small house on the other side of the city, the house I grew up in before my parents moved us to the suburbs when I was 12, and he's 87 now and his hands shake but his eyes are still sharp and he sees things other people don't see. I sat in his kitchen and I told him everything, the waiting room and the nail file and the golf magazine and the $700 a week that became $80,000 that became my brother's down payment, and he listened without speaking and then he poured me a glass of whiskey and poured himself one too and he said I told you, and I said I know, and he said I told you 20 years ago when he stole money from your lemonade stand and your mother said he was just being entrepreneurial. I told you 10 years ago when he took credit for your idea at that family business and your father said it was a team effort. I told you 5 years ago when he convinced your parents to co-sign a loan for his business that you knew was going to fail. I told you and you didn't listen. And I said I know, Grandpa, I know. And he said so what are you going to do about it now? And I said I don't know yet but I'm not going to let it go. And he looked at me for a long time and then he nodded and said good, because I have something to show you. He went into his bedroom and came back with an old shoebox, the kind you keep photographs in, and he opened it and inside there were letters and documents and a small digital voice recorder that looked like it was from about 15 years ago. He said your grandmother gave this to me before she died. She recorded conversations for years because she knew something was wrong with this family and she wanted proof, and I said proof of what? And he said proof of who they really are, and he pressed play and I heard my grandmother's voice, soft and tired, and then my mother's voice, younger and sharper, and then my brother's voice, even younger but already cold. And they were talking about my grandfather's will, about how they could challenge it, about how my grandmother didn't really understand what she was doing, about how the money should go to the people with potential, the people who could do something with it, not to someone who was just going to waste it on a regular life with a regular job and regular children. And I listened and I didn't breathe, and when it ended my grandfather said your grandmother recorded 23 conversations over 6 years. She knew she was dying and she wanted someone to have the truth. And I said why didn't you ever use this? And he said because I was hoping they would change, because I didn't want to believe that my own daughter and grandson were capable of that kind of cruelty, because I was a coward. And he looked at me with tears in his eyes and said don't be a coward like me, and I said I won't. I took the shoebox home and I listened to every recording. My grandmother had documented everything, the manipulations and the lies and the secret meetings and the plans to redirect money and property and affection away from anyone they considered less valuable, and as I listened I realized that I wasn't the first one they had done this to, I was just the latest, and that my grandmother had known and had tried to protect me but she had died before she could finish what she started. And now it was my turn. I thought about confronting them with the recordings, playing them at a family dinner, watching their faces change, but that wasn't enough. That was just pain. That wasn't justice, and I wanted justice. I wanted them to feel what I felt in that waiting room. I wanted them to understand that actions have consequences and that I was done being the person who absorbed those consequences so they didn't have to. Damn why husband got stronger. The twins turned 7. I went to work and came home and made dinner and helped with homework and kissed everyone good night, and then I sat in the dark and I planned. I started with small things, things they wouldn't notice, things that would seem like coincidences. My brother's favorite charity, the one he sat on the board of, the one that gave him social status and business connections, I found out they were doing a background check on all board members because of some embezzlement scandal at another organization, and I made an anonymous call and suggested they look more closely at his financials, not because I had any evidence of wrongdoing but because I knew that even an investigation, even a rumor of an investigation, would make him sweat. He called me 2 weeks later, his voice tight and strained for the first time in his life, and he said, "Do you know anything about this?" And I said, "About what?" And he said, "Someone's spreading lies about me." And I said, "That's terrible. Who would do that?" And he said, "I don't know, but when I find out I'll destroy them." And I said, "I'm sure you will." My mother called and said she missed me and why didn't I visit anymore, and what about the grandchildren? And I said, "The grandchildren are doing great. They're reading above grade level and they both made the soccer team." And she said, "Well, we never see them." And I said, "You never came to see them before either." And she said, "That's different. You used to bring them over." And I said, "I used to do a lot of things." And she started crying, these theatrical sobs that I'd heard my whole life and never recognized as manipulation until I listened to my grandmother's recordings and heard the same performance directed at her, and she said, "You're punishing us for one mistake." And I said, "It wasn't one mistake. It was 2 years of lies and $80,000 and a waiting room at 3 in the morning." And she said, "We didn't mean to hurt you." And I said, "That's the worst part, Mom. You didn't even think about me at all." And I hung up and I didn't answer when she called back, and why Father didn't call. That was the most telling thing of all. My father had never called me in my entire adult life, not for my birthday, not when the twins were born, not when my husband was in surgery, and he didn't call now. And I realized that my mother and brother were the architects, but my father was the foundation. His silence and indifference and refusal to engage was what made everything else possible, and I thought about how to make him feel something, how to reach someone who had spent his whole life perfecting the art of feeling nothing, and I didn't have an answer yet, but I put it on the list. The investigation into my brother's charity came back clean, but the damage was done. He missed 2 board meetings, and one of his major donors got nervous and pulled their funding, and another board member who had been considering a partnership with his company quietly withdrew their interest, and he called me screaming, actually screaming, and I listened and said, "I don't know why you're telling me this." And he said, "I know it was you." And I said, "Prove it." And he said, "I will." And I said, "Good luck with that," and hung up. My husband came into the living room and sat next to me and said, "Who was that?" And I said, "My brother." And he said, "What did he want?" And I said, "To threaten me." And he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "You've been different since my surgery. Something happened that you're not telling me." And I looked at him and I thought about all the years we'd been together and how he had never lied to me and how I was lying to him every day by not telling him the truth. And I told him everything, the money and the waiting room and the recordings and the anonymous call, and he listened without interrupting, and when I finished he said, "I always wondered why we never took vacations." And I said, "I'm sorry." And he said, "Don't be sorry. Just tell me what you need from me." And I said, "I need you to trust me." And he said, "I do." And I said, "Even if I do things you don't understand, even if I become someone you don't recognize." And he said, "You're not becoming someone else. You're becoming who you always should have been." And I cried for the first time since the waiting room, not because I was sad, but because I was so grateful and so tired and so ready. The next phase required access to my brother's life in ways I didn't have, not yet, and I spent 3 weeks building it. I'm not a hacker or a private investigator, I'm just a woman who sells medical equipment to hospitals, but I'm good at my job because I listen and I pay attention, and I understand that people will tell you everything you need to know if you just ask the right questions in the right way. My brother's assistant was a man named David who had been with him for 4 years and who I knew from family holiday parties, quiet and competent and completely invisible to my brother except when something went wrong, and I called him and said, "I'm putting together a birthday gift for my brother and I need some help." And he said, "Of course, what do you need?" And I said, "What's his favorite restaurant?" And he told me. And I said, "What's his favorite wine?" And he told me. And I said, "Who are his biggest clients right now?" And he paused and said, "I don't think I should share that information." And I said, "You're right, I'm sorry, that was inappropriate." And I could hear his relief and also his suspicion. And I said, "Let me ask you something else. Does he treat you well?" And there was a longer pause, and then he said, "I need to go." And he hung up, and I knew then that I had an ally, I just had to be patient. 2 weeks later I saw on social media that David had left my brother's employment, no explanation, just a new profile picture and a changed job status, and I sent him a message that said I hope you're doing okay, and he wrote back thank you, I am, and I wrote if you ever want to talk about it, I'm here, and he didn't respond but 3 days later he called me and said your brother made my life hell for 4 years. He screamed at me in front of clients. He made me work 70 hours a week and then blamed me when his personal relationships failed. He took credit for my ideas, and when I tried to talk to him about it, he said I was lucky to have a job at all. And I listened and I said, I'm sorry he did that to you. And David said, why are you really calling me? And I said, because I think you might have information that could help me. And he said, help you do what? And I said, help me make sure he can't do this to anyone else. And there was a long silence, and then he said, what do you need to know? What David told me changed everything. My brother's business was successful, but not as successful as he pretended. He was carrying significant debt, and the Tribeca condo was mortgaged to the maximum, and his major client, the one who represented 60% of his revenue, was a woman named Victoria who had been his mentor and then his lover and then his enemy and then his client. And their relationship was complicated and volatile, and David had documented every threatening email, every inappropriate demand, every promise made and broken, because he had learned from my brother that information is power, and he wanted power before he walked out the door. I asked him if I could see the documentation, and he said I'll think about it, and I said I understand, and I waited, and 3 days later an encrypted file appeared in my email with a note that said I don't know what you're planning, but I hope it hurts, and I wrote back thank you, and he wrote back you're welcome, and I never heard from him again. Victoria was in her late 50s, married, with 3 children in private schools, and a reputation for being ruthless in business and generous in charity, the kind of woman who sat on multiple boards and gave keynote speeches and had her photograph taken at galas with her arm around handsome men who were not her husband. My brother had been one of those men years ago, before he realized that being her lover was less valuable than being her vendor, and he had leveraged their history into a contract that made his company indispensable to hers, and she had resented him for it ever since because he knew things about her that she couldn't afford to have known. I studied the documentation David had sent and I saw the pattern, the late-night emails asking him to meet her at hotels, the promises of larger contracts in exchange for his discretion, the threats when he tried to pull away, and I thought about how to use this information without destroying myself in the process, and then I realized I didn't need to use it directly, I just needed Victoria to know that someone else had it. I sent her an anonymous letter, printed on plain paper from a public library computer, that said someone is gathering information about your relationship with my brother and I thought you should know, and I included one detail that only someone with access to their communications would know, and I waited. 3 days later my brother called me and his voice was different, not angry or threatening but something I had never heard from him before, scared, and he said Victoria terminated our contract this morning and I don't know why and I'm going to lose my business and I might lose the condo and I don't know what to do, and I said that's terrible, and he said please, I know you're angry about the money, I'll pay you back. I'll sell the condo and pay you back. Just tell me if you know anything about this, and I said I don't know what you're talking about, and he said I'm begging you, and I had waited 37 years to hear my brother say those words to me. I had dreamed about it in ways I never admitted to myself, and now that it was happening I felt nothing, no satisfaction, no triumph, just a cold emptiness that I filled with silence, and then I hung up. My parents called separately and together, leaving voicemails and texts and emails, and I deleted them without listening. My mother showed up at my house on a Sunday afternoon, something she had never done in the 7 years I had lived there, and I watched her through the window as she stood on the porch and rang the bell and waited, and I sat in the living room with my husband and my children and I didn't answer the door. She stood there for 20 minutes and then she drove away, and my husband said, "Do you want to talk about it?" And I said, "Not yet." And he nodded and handed me a cup of coffee, and we watched our children play in the backyard, and I thought about how strange it was that my mother had finally come to see me and I had chosen not to let her in, and how that choice felt like freedom. My brother lost his business. It took 6 months, which was longer than I expected, but the dominoes fell one by one and I watched from a distance as his life collapsed. Without Victoria's contract, he couldn't make the payments on his office lease. Without the office, he couldn't serve his remaining clients. Without his clients, he couldn't pay the mortgage on the condo. And without the condo, he couldn't maintain the image that attracted new clients. And it was all connected, all fragile, all built on money that wasn't really his and relationships that weren't really real. He called me every week for a while, and then every month, and then not at all, and I didn't call him either. and I thought about the $80,000 and how it had seemed like such a vast sum when I first learned about it, and now it was just a small part of a much larger debt that he could never repay, not because he didn't have the money but because he didn't understand what he had taken. My grandfather called me on a Tuesday night and said, "I saw your brother today, he came to see me," and I said, "What did he want?" And he said he wanted to know if I had any money he could borrow, and I laughed, actually laughed out loud, and he laughed too, and then he said I told him no, and I said thank you, and he said don't thank me, I didn't do it for you, I did it for your grandmother, and I said I know, and he said are you done yet? And I said no, not yet, and he said good, don't stop until you are. The thing about revenge is that it's never as clean as you imagine. I had spent months dismantling my brother's life and I had succeeded beyond anything I could have planned, but I didn't feel triumphant, I didn't feel satisfied, I just felt tired and hollow, and I kept thinking about the waiting room and the nail file and the golf magazine and how none of this would bring back the 2 years I had spent working for people who didn't love me, the vacations I never took, the bigger house I never bought. The peace I had believed in that turned out to be a lie. My husband watched me and said, "You're not done, are you?" And I said no, and he said, "What's next?" And I said, "My parents," and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know yet." I thought about my mother and father and what they had taken from me and what they still had that I could take from them. My father had retired 2 years ago and spent his days playing golf and reading magazines and avoiding anything that required emotional engagement, and my mother had her bridge club and her garden club and her book club and her reputation as a gracious hostess and devoted grandmother, and I thought about how to reach them, how to make them feel even a fraction of what I had felt in that waiting room. And I realized that the most painful thing I could do was not to attack them directly but to show them that the world they had built, the world in which they were good people who had made a small mistake, was a lie that I could expose at any time. I had my grandmother's recordings and I had David's documentation and I had months of texts and emails and voicemails that showed the true shape of my family, and I could release it all. I could send it to my mother's bridge club and my father's golf partners and everyone who had ever admired my brother's success, and I could watch their world burn. But that wasn't enough, that was just destruction. And I wanted something more than destruction. I wanted them to understand. I started with small things, like I had with my brother, things they wouldn't notice at first but would accumulate over time. My mother's bridge club had an annual charity auction that she chaired every year, the highlight of her social calendar, and I found out that one of the major donors had been my brother's client Victoria, and I made another anonymous call and suggested that perhaps the auction committee might want to reconsider accepting donations from a woman who had a well-documented history of sexually harassing her male employees. And the committee investigated and found enough to make them uncomfortable, and they quietly returned her donation, and my mother had to explain to her friends why the auction was suddenly short $50,000 and why no one was returning her calls. She called me, crying, and said, "Do you know what happened?" And I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Someone ruined the auction, someone spread lies about a donor, and now everyone thinks I'm incompetent." And I said, "That's terrible, Mom, who would do that?" And she said, "I don't know, but I can't stop crying." And I said, "I'm sorry you're upset." And she said, "Will you come over? I need to see you." And I said, "I can't, the twins of soccer." And she said, "Please." And I said, "Maybe next week." And I hung up. And I didn't call back. My father's golf partners started asking questions about my brother's business failure and the rumors about Victoria and why my mother had been crying at the bridge club, and my father didn't have answers because he had spent his whole life not asking questions, not engaging, not caring, and suddenly his world was full of questions he couldn't avoid and he didn't know what to do. He called me, which had never happened before in my entire adult life, and he said, "Your mother is very upset and I don't understand what's happening." And I said, "I don't know what to tell you, Dad." And he said, "Is it about the money? Is that what this is about?" And I said, "What money?" And he said, "The money we gave your brother." And I said, "You mean my money?" And he said, "Yes, that money." And I said, "Are you asking me if I'm responsible for what's happening to Mom and your son?" And he said, "Yes, I guess I am." And I said, "Why would you think that?" And he said, "Because you're the only one who has ever held anyone in this family accountable for anything." And I was quiet for a long time, and then I said, "I have to go, Dad, the twins are waiting." And he said, "Wait, please wait, I don't know how to fix this." And I said, "Maybe you should have thought about that before you spent 2 years pretending I didn't exist while you took my money and gave it to him." And he said, "We didn't mean to hurt you." And I said, "I know, Dad, that's what Mom said, and it's still not an apology." And I hung up. My grandfather called me that night and said, "I heard you talk to your father." And I said, "How did you know?" And he said, "Your mother called me crying. She said you're destroying the family." And I said, "I'm not destroying it, I'm just showing them what it really looks like." and he was quiet, and then he said your grandmother would be proud of you, and I said I don't know if that's true, and he said it is. She spent the last years of her life trying to get someone to see what she saw, and you're the only one who ever did, and I said what do I do now? And he said you finish it, whatever that means to you, and I said what if I don't know what that means, and he said then you wait until you do. I waited 3 weeks. During those weeks my mother called 17 times and left messages that went from angry to sad to desperate to resigned. My father called twice and said nothing, just breathed into the phone until I hung up, and my brother didn't call at all. I went to work and came home and made dinner and helped with homework and kissed my husband and children goodnight, and then I sat in the dark and I thought about my grandmother and her shoebox of recordings and what she would have wanted me to do with the truth she had spent years gathering. I thought about releasing everything, sending it to everyone my family knew, burning down their world and walking away, but that felt like violence, not justice, and I had spent my whole life absorbing violence from them, and I didn't want to become someone who inflicted it on others, even if they deserved it. I wanted something else, something quieter and more permanent, something that would sit in their chests like the cold hard thing that sat in mine. I found it in my grandmother's recordings, in the one conversation I had listened to a dozen times and never fully understood until that night. It was between my mother and my brother, recorded about a year before my grandmother died, and they were discussing my grandfather's will, the one that left everything to my grandmother and then to me, and my mother said we can contest it, we can say he wasn't of sound mind, and my brother said we need evidence, and my mother said I can get evidence, I'm his daughter, no one will question me, and my brother said do it then, and my mother said what about the money? And my brother said the money will go to me and I'll take care of you, and I listened to that conversation and I realized that the betrayal in the waiting room wasn't the beginning and it wasn't the end, it was just one moment in a long history of moments stretching back decades, and that my mother and brother had been planning to steal my inheritance before I even knew I had one, and that my grandfather knew and had protected me from them and had never told me because he didn't want me to carry that weight. I called him at midnight and said, did you know? And he said, no what? And I said that they tried to steal your will, that Mom was going to lie about your mental health to get your money, and he was quiet for so long I thought he had hung up, and then he said yes, I knew, and I said why didn't you tell me, and he said because I was ashamed, because she's my daughter and I didn't want to believe she was capable of that, because I thought if I confronted her she would deny it and I would lose her. And I wasn't ready to lose her, and I said but she was going to take everything from me, and he said I know, and I stopped it. I changed my will and I put it in a trust and I made sure she couldn't touch it. And I said but you didn't tell me, you didn't warn me, you let me keep believing she loved me, and he said I know, and I'm sorry, and I said I have to go, and I hung up. I didn't sleep that night or the next night. I thought about my grandfather who had loved me and protected me and also lied to me by omission for 30 years, and I thought about my grandmother who had recorded those conversations and left them in a shoebox because she wanted someone to have the truth, and I thought about my parents and my brother who had spent my entire life taking from me and calling it love, and I thought about my husband and children who were the only real family I had ever had, and I made a decision. I called my grandfather the next morning and I said I forgive you, and he started crying, and I said but I need you to help me finish this, and he said what do you need, and I said I need you to be there when I confront them, and he said I will be there, and I said I need you to tell them what you know, what you've always known, and he said I will, and I said I need you to be strong, and he said I will, I promise, and I said okay then, let's do it. I called my mother and said I want to have dinner, all of us at your house next Saturday, and she said really, and I said yes, and she said your brother will come, and I said I know, and she said your father will be there, and I said I know, and she said your grandfather too, and I said yes, and she said oh honey, this is wonderful, I knew you would come around, I knew you couldn't stay angry forever, and I said I'm not angry anymore, Mom, and she said I knew it, I just knew it, and I said, see you Saturday, and I hung up. I spent the week preparing. I copied my grandmother's recordings onto my phone and onto a USB drive and onto a cloud server, and I wrote down everything I wanted to say, not because I needed a script, but because I needed to organize 37 years of pain into something coherent enough to deliver in one night. My husband watched me and said, are you sure about this? And I said no, but I'm doing it anyway, and he said, do you want me to come? And I said no, I need you here with the twins, I need to know that no matter what happens tonight, you and they are safe and separate from all of this, and he said you come back to us, and I said I will, and he said I mean it, whatever happens you come back, and I said I will. Saturday was cold and gray, the sky the color of dirty dishwater, and I drove to my parents' house in the suburbs and sat in the car for 10 minutes before I went inside. My grandfather arrived right after me, walking slowly with his cane but standing straight, and he looked at me and nodded and we walked in together. My mother had decorated for fall, pumpkins and gourds and dried leaves arranged artfully on the dining table, and she was wearing a sweater I had given her 3 years ago for Christmas. The one she had said was too bright, but she would wear it anyway, and she hugged me and cried and said, "I'm so glad you're here," and I didn't hug her back. I just stood there and waited for her to let go. My father was in his chair in the living room, watching golf, and he muted the television when I walked in and said hello, and I said hello, and that was the extent of our conversation. My brother arrived last, 10 minutes late, and he looked thinner than I remembered and his clothes were expensive but not new and he had dark circles under his eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide, and he said thank you for inviting me, and I said thank you for coming, and we sat down to dinner like a normal family having a normal meal. My mother served pot roast, my father's favorite, and she talked about her bridge club and the upcoming holiday season and how she was thinking of redecorating the guest room, and my father ate and grunted occasionally, and my brother picked at his food and said nothing, and my grandfather sat with his hands folded and waited, and I waited too. The silence stretched between us, heavy and strange, and my mother filled it with more words, more chatter, more desperate attempts to pretend that everything was normal, and finally I put down my fork and said I'm not here to reconcile, and my mother stopped mid-sentence and looked at me, and my father looked up from his plate, and my brother went very still, and I said I'm here to tell you what I know and what I've done and what's going to happen now. And my mother said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "I'll start at the beginning." I told him about the waiting room and the nail file and the golf magazine and the $80,000, and my mother said we already apologized for that, and I said you didn't apologize, you explained, and she said well we're sorry, we said we were sorry, and I said no, you said you didn't mean to hurt me, which is not an apology, it's an excuse, and my father said is this what tonight is about, are you here to lecture us? And I said no, I'm here to tell you what I did next. I told him about the anonymous call to the charity and the investigation and the board member who withdrew their interest, and my brother's face went white and he said I knew it was you, and I said yes, it was me, and I told him about Victoria and David and the documentation and the letter I sent, and my brother started crying, not theatrical sobs but real ragged breaths, and he said you destroyed me, you took everything from me, and I said no, I just showed everyone what you really are, the destruction was yours, and my mother said how could you do this to your own brother, and I said how could you give him my money, and she said that was different, and I said it wasn't different, it was exactly the same, you chose him over me and you've been doing it my whole life and I finally stopped letting you. My father said I think you should leave, and I said not yet, I'm not finished, and I took out my phone and I said I have something you need to hear, and I played my grandmother's recording of my mother and brother discussing how to steal my grandfather's will. The voices filled the dining room, my mother's younger and sharper, my brother's cold and calculating, and when it ended no one spoke for a long time. My mother looked at the table, my brother stared at the wall, my father looked at my mother with something I had never seen in his face before, something that might have been recognition, and my grandfather sat with tears running down his cheeks and said I have carried this for 15 years and I am done carrying it. Your mother recorded those conversations because she knew what you were and she wanted someone to have the truth. And I hid it because I was a coward, but I'm not a coward anymore. My mother said that was taken out of context, that was a difficult time, we were worried about Dad's health, we never would have actually done it, and my brother said nothing, just sat there with his hands clenched in his lap, and I said I have 22 more recordings, Mom, do you want to hear them? Do you want to hear what else you said about Grandma and Grandpa and me and everyone else who got in your way? Do you want to hear yourself lying and manipulating and planning to steal from your own father? And my mother said please, please don't do this, and I said why not, you did it to me for 37 years, you took my money and my time and my love and you gave it to him because he was the one with potential, he was the one who mattered, and I was just the one who paid for it all, and my mother said that's not true, we love you, we've always loved you, and I said if this is love I don't want it. My father stood up, slowly, and I thought he was going to leave the room or tell me to leave, but instead he looked at my mother and said did you really try to change Dad's will? And my mother said it wasn't like that, and he said did you, and she was quiet, and he said I married you 43 years ago and I thought I knew you and I didn't, I never knew you at all, and my mother said please, not you too, and my father said I'm tired, I'm so tired, and he walked out of the room and I heard the front door open and close and I knew he was gone and I didn't know if he was coming back. My brother finally spoke. His voice was flat, drained of all the warmth and manipulation and performance I had heard my whole life, and he said, "What do you want from us? What will make this stop?" And I said, "I want you to understand." And he said, "Understand what? That you're better than me, that you won. Is that what you want to hear?" And I said, "No, I want you to understand that I was your sister and you treated me like an enemy and I don't know why." And he said, "Because you had everything I wanted." And I laughed, actually. Laughed, and said, "What did I have? I worked 60 hours a week and drove a car with 200,000 miles and never took a vacation, and you had the corner office and the penthouse and the charity galas. What did I have that you wanted?" And he said, "You had mom and dad's love." And I said, "Are you serious? They gave you my money and you think they loved me more?" And he said, "They gave me money because I asked for it. You never asked for anything. You just gave and expected them to love you for it, and they didn't. They took it for granted because you made it easy, you made it effortless, and I had to fight for everything I got from them, and I still never got enough, and you never even had to try, and they still didn't love you enough either. Don't you see? None of us ever got enough. We're all starving for the same thing, and there was never enough to go around." I looked at my brother, and for the first time in my life I didn't see an enemy. I saw someone as broken as me, someone who had spent his whole life chasing approval from people who didn't have it to give, and I thought about all the years we had spent competing for a prize that didn't exist, and I said it didn't have to be like this. We could have been on the same side. And he said, "I know," and I said, "It's too late now." And he said, "I know that too." And I said, "What are you going to do?" And he said, "I don't know. I lost my business and I'm losing the condo and I have no money and no clients and no reputation and I don't know who I am without all of it." And I said, "You could start over." And he said, "How?" And I said, "I don't know, but you could try." And he said, "Would you help me?" And I said, "No, I can't help you. I can't ever help you again, but I won't stop you from helping yourself." And he nodded and stood up and walked out of the room, and I heard the front door open and close, and I knew he was gone, and I didn't know if he was coming back. My mother sat alone at the head of the table, surrounded by her fall decorations and the remains of her pot roast, and she looked at me and said, "What about me? What am I supposed to do?" And I said, "I don't know, Mom. What do you want to do?" And she said, "I want my family back." And I said, "This is your family. We were always right here. You just didn't see us." And she started crying and said, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just trying to survive." And I said, "Survive what? You had a husband who worked in a house in the suburbs and two healthy children, and you never went hungry or cold or afraid. What were you surviving?" And she said, "I was surviving your father's silence and my mother's disappointment and the feeling that I had wasted my life on a man who never looked at me and children who needed more than I could give, and I was so tired. I was always so tired, and I just wanted someone to tell me I was doing a good job. I just wanted to feel like I mattered." And I said, I told you every Friday when I sent that money. I said, "Thank you for everything you do." I said, "I hope this helps." I said, "I love you." I said it 100 times and you never heard me. And she said, I know. And I said, "I have to go now." And she said, "Please don't leave me, not tonight, not like this." And I said, "I have to, Mom, I have to go home to my husband and my children. They're waiting for me." And she said, "Will you come back?" And I said, "I don't know." And I walked out the door and I didn't look back. My grandfather was waiting for me in the driveway, leaning on his cane, and he said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "No, are you?" And he said, "No." And I said, "I don't feel like I won anything, I just feel tired." And he said, "That's because revenge isn't winning, it's just finishing." And I said, "Is it finished?" And he said, "I don't know, is it?" And I thought about my brother driving home to his empty condo, and my father walking alone in the cold, and my mother sitting at her table surrounded by her fall decorations, and I said, "I think so, I think I'm done." And he said, "Then let's go home." And I drove him to his house and walked him to his door, and he hugged me, the first time he had hugged me since I was a child, and he said, "Your grandmother would be proud of you." And I said, "I hope so." And he said, "I know so." And I drove home to my husband and my children, and I sat on the couch and I held them, and I didn't tell them what happened, not that night. And I thought about my grandmother and her shoebox of recordings and how she had spent the last years of her life gathering truth because she believed that someday someone would need it, and I had been that someone. And I had used it not for violence but for revelation, not for destruction but for exposure, and I didn't know if that was enough. I didn't know if it would ever be enough, but I knew it was all I had and all I could do, and I had done it. I had finally done it. And I closed my eyes and I slept for the first time in months. When my phone rang at 3 in the morning, I already knew something was wrong because my brother never called me unless he wanted something, and this time what he wanted was for me to rush to the hospital where my husband was being prepped for emergency surgery. And when I got there, out of breath and still wearing the paint-stained sweatshirt I'd been wearing while fixing the twins' bunk beds, I found my mother and father sitting in the waiting room like they were waiting for a delayed flight. My mother filing her nails and my father reading a golf magazine, and I asked them where my brother was and my mother said, without looking up, "Oh, he had a charity gala tonight. Very important donors. He sends his love," and I remember the fluorescent lights buzzing and the smell of antiseptic and the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking. And I said my husband is upstairs with a ruptured appendix and our twins are 6 years old and he's the only parent they've ever really had because I work 60 hours a week so I can send you $700 every Friday. And my mother looked at me then, finally, and said we really need to talk about that money, honey, because your brother is buying a condo in Tribeca and your father, and I thought it would be nice if we helped him with the down payment. And I said, what are you talking about? I send you that money for groceries and medications. And my father turned a page of his magazine and said, well, we've been saving most of it. It added up to about 80,000 over the last 2 years, and your brother is going to pay us back eventually. It's an investment in the family. And I stood there in that waiting room with my husband's blood type written on a whiteboard behind the nurse's station, and I said, that's my money. I worked double shifts, and I never took a vacation, and I drove a car with 200,000 miles so you wouldn't have to worry. And my mother finally put down her nail file and looked at me with this expression I'd seen my whole life but never really understood until that moment, this calm condescending pity like I was a child who didn't understand how the world worked. And she said, your brother has always had such potential, you know that. He moves in circles we can't even imagine, and this condo puts him in the building where the hedge fund partners live. It's an investment in his future, and besides, you're doing fine. You have that house and those beautiful children. What do you need $80,000 for? That's more important than your brother's future. And I couldn't speak because the rage was so thick in my throat it felt like drowning. And then the surgeon came out and said the surgery went well, but there were complications, and your husband is stable, but he's going to need a lot of care, and you should prepare for at least 6 weeks of recovery. And I nodded and thanked him, and then I turned back to my parents, and my mother was already putting her nail file back in her purse, and my father was folding his magazine, and my mother said, well, we should get home, it's late, and tell your brother we're so proud of him. And they walked out into the rain, and I watched them through the glass doors, and I didn't cry. I just stood there, and I thought about every Friday for the last 2 years, every transfer I made from my checking account, every overtime shift, every vacation I said maybe next year. And I thought about my brother at his charity gala drinking champagne and shaking hands with people who would never know that his down payment came from my children's college fund and my husband's recovery and my own exhaustion. And I thought about my parents who had chosen him over me, not in some dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small betrayals that added up to $80,000 and a waiting room at 3 in the morning. And I thought about my grandfather who had tried to warn me years ago, who had said your brother has your mother's heart and your father's indifference, and that's a dangerous combination. And I had told him he was being dramatic, that family was family, that love covered everything. And I stood there in the buzzing fluorescent light with the smell of antiseptic and rain and betrayal, and I didn't cry, I just breathed. And then I walked upstairs to sit with my husband, and I held his hand while he slept, and I watched the monitors beep, and I made a decision that felt like cutting off my own arm to save the rest of my body, and that was the moment I knew the real revenge begins now. If you're drawn to intense, true-feeling stories of betrayal, revenge, and justice that cuts deep, make sure you subscribe to this channel. These stories only get darker from here. I didn't sleep that night or the next night or really any night for the next 2 weeks because I was at the hospital from 7 in the morning until 10 at night, and then I went home and I made lunches for the twins and I signed permission slips and I helped with homework and I put them to bed, and then I sat in the dark in my living room and I tried to understand how I had been so blind. My husband came home on a Thursday and I carried him up the stairs because the incision was still healing, and he laughed and said I was being ridiculous, and then he cried because he was in pain and scared and exhausted. And I held him and said, everything is going to be fine. I've got this, you just rest. And he looked at me with those tired eyes and said, I know you do. You always take care of everyone. And I almost told him then about the money and my parents and my brother, but I didn't because he needed to heal and he didn't need to carry this weight too, and also because I wasn't ready yet. I didn't have a plan, I just had this cold hard thing inside my chest where my heart used to be.